Jared, can you turn those lights on?
Yes.
So sorry just a brief break, but yesterday, of course, we were welcomed by the administration of WAU and by the president of the Association of SDA Historians. So today we're in the GC, and so we thought it appropriate you should be welcomed by the head of this building, who also happens to be the president of the World Church. Perhaps in some ways needs no introduction, but let me just tell you a couple of things you may not know about the president of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. He actually is an historian. His PhD from New York University was an analysis of Ellen White's thought on mission to inner cities in the context of other late 19th and early 20th century theorists and practitioners of mission to cities. I think he must be the first General Conference president who has a PhD in history, which we'll hope that there will be many more in the future. He's also, as I know personally, not only interested in, but very knowledgeable about Seventh-day Adventist history, and has been very supportive of various historical projects, including the commemoration of the sesquicentenary of the church in 2013, and other historic commemorations, and we're glad to welcome him today.
Thank you, David, and good morning.
Good morning.
We had a little surprise this morning with some ice, but that's not unusual for many of you from climates that may be a bit more challenging than this one. I want to welcome you to your General Conference headquarters. This is the home of the world headquarters, which you are a part of. And I wish to especially encourage each of you as you work together in the Association of Seventh-day Adventist Historians to understand that this place is a place where history is made. And in fact, this is where history is stored. And this is where history will be made. But let's not inflate our opinions of ourselves too highly. History is made here and around the world, represented by the General Conference, because we have a worldwide family that is now headed towards 21 million brothers and sisters. And David and his team are in charge of helping to keep track of all of that and lets us know. But history is made here and around the world, represented by this building, for only one purpose, and that is to advance the proclamation of the three angels' messages and the mission that God has entrusted to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, to prepare people for the second coming of Jesus Christ. I have to tell you, in all the travels that I do, and I travel extensively, I am seeing signs around the world, and certainly in this country, that prophetic understanding in the historical sense, as Seventh-day Adventists have generally understood it, is coming to a climax. When will the Lord return? We do not know. But that's something that you as historians, as you look at the past, need to also look to the future. All glory is to be given to God alone. And the Holy Spirit is going to lead us as we lean on Him. And how will our history develop depends upon our ability to lean in selfless service upon the Lord. Too often, historians see the traits of selfishness, of self-centeredness throughout the records of history, and yes, unfortunately, even church history. But I just want to urge you, as you convene here and as you continue your work and as you work as historians, that by God's grace, may we be producing history which is selfless, God-centered history. As you do your research and as you participate, some of you, in the Seventh-day Adventist Encyclopedia Project and other activities, as you write historical essays and research articles, may you find dedicated, humble endeavors led by the Holy Spirit. And I truly believe that my profession and other professions will fade away when the Lord returns. But you know what? We are assured that historians will always have a place in eternity. In fact, I don't know whether the Association of Seventh-day Adventist Historians will exist in heaven, because everyone will be a historian. Everyone will be called upon to look at the records and to review how God has led us in the past. But until that time, in my welcome to you, I want to encourage you as Seventh-day Adventist historians, first of all, to be close to the Lord yourself. And I say that to myself. Secondly, to be honest, to be accurate, to be full of integrity, to be careful, and to be gracious in giving the benefit of the doubt. For you hold the key, in many cases, to interpret history. May you be engaged in that activity through the leading of the Holy Spirit. May your work be educational, and most of all, may you bring hope out of your research. And perhaps in closing, that is the unique, your unfortunate tasks, to uncover and accurately report how people have misused the treasure God has put in their hands. They cannot lift up holy hands to God without wrath and doubting. This has become because God has not control over their minds. Well, it means that God doesn't have control over the minds of those leaders, but I would pray that as you look at history, that God will have control over your mind. And just a few ending items here. Education. I just finished reading the book Education this morning. I hope you have looked at that book. It's an amazing book. Page 173, the Bible is the most ancient and the most comprehensive history that men possess. The Bible reveals the true philosophy of history. Page 238. As with language, so with every other study, it may be so conducted that it will tend to the strengthening and upbuilding of character. Of no study is this true to a greater degree than of history. Let it be considered from the divine point of view. There are those who consider the Bible to be nothing but a collection of reflections of individuals at the time of its writing. The Seventh-day Adventist Church officially, and I hope that you personally, do not believe that. But that it is the divine Word of God. And lastly, two beautiful quotes. Again, in education, page 304. This is talking about heaven now, and this is what you have to look forward to, and all of us. There will be open to the student history of infinite scope and of wealth inexpressible. Here, from the vantage ground of God's Word, the student is afforded a view of the vast field of history and may gain some knowledge of the principles that govern the course of human events. But his vision is still clouded, meaning at the present time, and his knowledge incomplete. Not until he stands in the light of eternity will he see all things clearly. So, your work is never ending, and you will continue throughout eternity. In the book Education, it did make reference, as I recall, at the very end, about time. I can only think about eternity for about 2 seconds, and I have to stop, because I cannot understand when there was no time and when there will be no time. Historians are tied to time, but in heaven, you will be free to study history for eternity. And then, of course, this last quote, which you're all familiar with, and which is a guiding experience for all of us. I will say that we will be going to Battle Creek for annual council this year. We have a very heavy emphasis on history. And the theme that has basically been chosen, which Jim Nix has helped to promote, and David, I think, is probably part of that, the past with a future. And I like to think about looking to the past to understand our mission for the future. So we will be there, and we will encourage people to think back. In fact, we've encouraged our executive committee members, obviously, those who are men. The women will have other ways of expressing it, but we've encouraged our executive committee members who can and who wish to join some of you in growing beards. So we'll see how many are brave enough to do that and who will look distinguished like you do. But when we meet there in Battle Creek, we will be looking back. And why? Well, this quotation, which is very familiar to all of you, and which should be perhaps a theme for a historian. Life Sketches 196. In reviewing our past history, having traveled over every step of advance to our present standing, I can say, praise God. As I see what the Lord has wrought, I am filled with astonishment and with confidence in Christ as leader. And believe me, none of us are the leader. If we ever assume that position, we're finished. Christ is the leader of this church. And going on, it says, we have nothing to fear for the future except as we shall forget the way the Lord has led us and his teaching in our past history. So I welcome you on behalf of the General Conference of your World Church, and I challenge you to contribute perhaps the most important aspect that a Seventh-day Adventist historian can contribute. And that is to bring hope out of your work, hope in the leading of God. Thank you and welcome.
So we've introduced Ruth and her work on missionaries in the Pacific, and Lindsay, who is a Seventh-day Adventist pastor and has had a lot of administrative responsibilities, but his PhD is in ecclesiology, and his academic interests include ecclesiology and the question of hermeneutics, poverty, and suffering, and the concept of alterity in the thought of Emmanuel Levinus. He's currently pastoring in Canada. Gary Krause, who's next to Ruth there, is director of the Office of Adventist Mission, associate executive secretary of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. Don't know if that means you have to grow a beard or not. He holds a master's in journalism from the University of Technology in Sydney. So we do have a lot of Australian influence here on this panel, and is currently completing a doctorate at the University of Queensland, writing a dissertation on Adventist approaches to mission in urban areas. He has published many articles in church periodicals and websites, along with several scholarly articles on missiology, 2 scholarly book chapters on Adventist history in Australia, and the article on Ellen White for the Australian Dictionary of Biography. So we'll just go in the order in which you're listed, and we'll have some time for questions at the end.
Well, it's lovely to be with you all. Those of you who heard me present at last year a few years ago will be relieved or perhaps disappointed to know that there's no bombshells in this paper. Seventh-day Adventist missionaries arrived in China shortly after the Boxer Rebellion. Adventists arrived in 1902, and the Boxer Rebellion was from 1898 to 1900. Therefore, the anti-Christian movement of 1922 to 1927 was the first experience of widespread persecution for the church in China for the church. The anti-Christian movement had its roots in the New Culture movement, which developed after 1919, and although critical of all religions, Christianity was particularly singled out. The influence of the May 4th movement, also 1919, which was a reaction to the giving by the Treaty of Versailles of German colonies in China to Japan, rather than returning them to China, even though China had also supported the Allied war effort, also led to an increase in Chinese nationalism. Christianity was closely tied in the minds of many Chinese to foreign imperialism. Therefore, it was a prime target of nationalistic attacks. Chen argues that at the time of the United Front, 1924, both the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang recognised the anti-Christian movement as also being anti-imperialist, and therefore this movement had the support of both parties. Liu and Kelly contend that due to the inseparability of Western missionaries from Western imperialism, missionaries bore the brunt of anti-Western sentiment and aggression. The southern government, which was Kuomintang, was more strongly anti-Christian than that of the north, and thus, due to the widespread geographic distribution of Seventh-day Adventist missionary activity, some Seventh-day Adventist mission stations were able to continue operation without too much interference. However, with the onset of the Northern Expedition, which was the attempt by the Kuomintang to expand their influence over all of China and unify China, the influence of the southern governments and the Kuomintang spread, and the anti-Christian movement became connected with military action. As a result, Christian institutions, including those belonging to Seventh-day Adventist Church, bore the brunt of violent attacks and in some cases were destroyed altogether. The hostility which the Seventh-day Adventist missionaries and church members encountered and the destruction of property which occurred did not, as one would expect, affect the church's commitment to the placement of missionaries in China. In contrast to other denominations, the unique Seventh-day Adventist worldview and its theological interpretation of these events positioned the crisis in China as a sign of the fulfillment of prophecy. Seventh-day Adventist eschatology anticipates a time of trouble before the return of Jesus Christ. Therefore, the events in China were situated within this framework. For example, C.C. Chrysler, when recounting the experience of Seventh-day Adventists in Jiangxi, stated, "We were led to wonder whether we were not now entering upon troublous times that shall know no ending until our work shall have been completed." This viewpoint viewed the persecution in China as validation of the denomination's theological beliefs. As a result, Seventh-day Adventist missionaries remained in China during this period, and new missionaries were actively recruited. The continued promotion of the missionary activity in China within the pages of the Church's premier English language publication, the Review and Herald, was reflective of the official Church stance. Writing in 1927 for the Review, Frederick Lee, an American missionary to China, informed his readers that Christians had once been able to operate freely within China and could go and preach with little persecution. Westerners and all they taught were respected. He then contrasted this with the present situation. On every side there are active anti-Christian and anti-Western agitations. Our evangelists and colporteurs are daily being threatened. These evangelists and colporteurs were not foreign missionaries, but Chinese converts employed by the church, demonstrating that anti-Christian feeling was not only confined to foreigners, but to any Chinese who had converted. Lee noted that it was now much more difficult for people to accept the Christian or Seventh-day Adventist message, but he framed the situation in distinctly religious and positive terms. We believe that these fiery trials have come to perfect and purify the church in China, to strengthen the native leaders and thus hasten the finishing of the work. The problems facing the converts and missionaries were seen in a positive light as a means of strengthening the church. Seventh-day Adventist readers would have understood the phrase "the work" to mean the spreading of the gospel message and warning people of the soon coming of Jesus. Similarly, George Apple, writing for the Review in April 1927, stated, "You have no doubt heard of the serious times our people are having in South and Central China. Surely we are living down in the close of this earth's history, and the time is very short for finishing the work." The difficult experiences of the church were perceived by the denomination as a sure sign that they were living in the last days of Earth's history. Because of their distinctive eschatology, the situation in China was viewed by Seventh-day Adventist missionaries and administrators not so much as a crisis, but as an opportunity. Harry Miller, in June 1927 article for the Review, recommended that the church should have a score of missionary families out to China at this very time to start the study of language and pass quickly onto the fields when prepared, so as to establish new centres from which we can gather from the villages and country districts the fruit of the harvest. This was in contrast to the reaction of other Protestant denominations to the anti-Christian movement. Stone Garrett's study has demonstrated that there was great public controversy in the United States, and many people, even within the evangelical churches, loudly questioned whether China any longer wanted, needed, or deserved missionaries. However, a repeated refrain within Adventist literature during the 20s and early 1930s was that of the progress made in spite of the crisis. Apple, in a 1927 report for the Review, told readers that despite the troubles in North China, membership had nearly doubled in the last 2 years and the number of sales of the denomination's literature had markedly increased. While Seventh-day Adventist missionaries were in some instances withdrawn from their stations in the interior and relocated to major cities during this period, the church continued to send new missionaries to China. So now we're going to look at some figures. In 1926, a total of 47 adults, children accompanied their parents but were not counted in official figures, were sent by the Seventh-day Adventist Church to China. This was to add to the 125 missionaries already working in the country. As the denomination employed 293 missionaries globally for that year, the new missionary contingent to China made up 16% of that figure. 1927 saw an overall decline in the number of new missionaries employed worldwide. 184 new missionaries were employed, while 81 returned to their mission fields after furlough. However, despite the decline, the proportion of missionaries sent to China remained steady. When compared to 1926, 28 new missionaries were sent to China in 1927, comprising 15% of the total missionaries that were sent abroad. In 1928, 34 missionaries were sent to China to join the 137 foreign missionaries already there. However, 64% of these missionaries were returning after furlough rather than new hires. But these figures indicate that the setbacks for the denomination in China were not significantly hindering its missionary program. The Methodists, by contrast, at the Shanghai Bishops' meeting in September 25, formally recommended that the board that while there should be no reduction in the missionary staff, the board should exercise great restraint in the sending of new missionaries and there should be no expansion in building. The Seventh-day Adventist Church formally opened the Shanghai Sanitarium and Hospital in that year, showing no evidence of restraint in the building of institutions or the sending of new missionaries. An article printed in the 1930 Review, written by Harry Miller, promoted the idea that Seventh-day Adventist mission in China was unique by stating that in contrast to other missions, the denomination was actively working in China. He wrote, "At this very time, some other missions are standing still. They are waiting for the war to cease. Their boards won't give them any money to go ahead." By contrasting Seventh-day Adventist activity with his perceived inertia of other denominations, Miller is playing to the theological and philosophical underpinnings of the Church's worldview of the denomination's status as a unique and remnant church with a special message for the world. Miller's observation that other denominations were standing still was not completely accurate, as it grouped all Protestant churches together and failed to account for individual responses from the numerous Protestant denominations operating in China. His attempt to create a sense of uniqueness surrounding the Seventh-day Adventist Church's work in China, while serving to contribute to a discourse which privileged the singularity of the Church, did not represent the complexity of the situation. As Stone Garrett's study demonstrates, Methodist activity in China certainly suffered as a result of the backlash in the United States against the anti-Christian movement and the losses both in lives and property suffered during the Nanjing incident. Furthermore, internal philosophical divisions within the Methodist Church regarding the role of missionaries and the onset of the Great Depression also led to a reduction in funds available to the work in China. She states that in 1929 the mission receipts showed a decline of more than 20% from the corresponding months of 1928. China was responsible. The China Christian Yearbook for 1936 to 37 records that the Board of Foreign Missions of the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Women's Foreign Missionaries Society had the number of missionaries in China drop from 553 in 1924 to 296 in 1929. Similarly, the Methodist Episcopal Church South saw the number of missionaries in China fall from 147 in 1924 to 87 in 1929. Neither of these groups regained their early number of missionaries in China, but the Congregationalists also suffered a reduction in missionary numbers. Thompson cites was facing further reductions. So these figures did withdraw their missionaries from potentially dangerous areas into Shanghai and then out of the country in response to the crisis in 1927, but they did not suffer such a serious significant reduction in funding as was the case in the Methodists. This was due in part to the differing theological underpinnings of the theory of mission in these two denominations. Many Methodists questioned the imperialism inherent in missionary activity. This is the rise of the social gospel and those kind of things. While Presbyterian a reduction in the number of missionaries from 568 in 1924 to 349 in 1929, the number of its missionaries grew in China during the 1930s, and by 1937 there were 408 missionaries from this denomination in the country. The Seventh-day Adventists also withdrew their foreign staff from Nanjing and other areas of conflict in 1927. However, these missionaries remained in Shanghai, attending Chinese language classes until it was safe for them to return to their areas of employment. The Seventh-day Adventist Church actually employed teachers from the University Language School in Nanjing who'd been displaced by the fighting there. As many as 60 Seventh-day Adventist missionaries attended the language school in Shanghai during this time. In addition, new missionaries to China were actively recruited and sent to China throughout 1927 and 1928. The leadership of both the Methodist and Presbyterian denominations did express concern regarding the impact the situation in China would have on their domestic membership's attitude towards missionary activity. The Presbyterian leadership told the China Council not to make any public statements on China's internal and political matters, and it edited China Council letters carefully for domestic release. Both the Methodists and Presbyterians stressed to their constituents that the events in China did not represent the real China, and that the violence in the nationalist movement was only a passing phase owing to communist influence. Methodist case on a much smaller scale. The most significant loss of property for the Seventh-day Adventist Church occurred in the Nanjing incident in 1927. The denomination's college, the China Theological Seminary at Taotiao near Nanjing, was destroyed. The phrase used was "not one brick left upon the other." However, there was no debate within the church as to whether or not the college should continue operation. The school was almost immediately rebuilt and reopened for classes in 1928. In fact, signalling its commitment to the work of the church in China, the General Conference designated China as the recipient of the Week of Sacrifice offerings for 1927. The Week of Sacrifice was where members were encouraged to give an entire week's wages to the mission of the church. J.L. Shaw, treasurer of the GC, outlined the plans for the money, stating, "As far as possible, mission homes in our college near Nanking will be rehabilitated." It was noted that the whole offering would be donated to China, not just to rebuild Taotiao, but also to maintain the ongoing work there. The one exception to this was the offerings from the denomination's schools and colleges, which had been earmarked for mission work in Central Africa. Unlike the Methodist denomination, whose leadership, as Stone Garrett has shown, was concerned that bad news from China might affect donations from members, the destruction of property was actively reported in Seventh-day Adventist literature and used as a tool to encourage its church members to donate more money to the work of overseas missions. This is a direct outgrowth of the SDA eschatological belief that they were living in the last days and therefore needed to work harder in order to warn as many people as possible of the soon coming of Christ. As a result, the Seventh-day Adventists were the only Protestant denomination whose numbers of missionaries increased in China during the period between 1920 missionaries, foreign missionaries in China, out of 37 Protestant mission organisations listed in the China Christian Yearbook, as having 122 missionaries employed. By 1929, this number had grown to 195, making it the fourth largest Protestant denomination in China in terms of foreign missionaries. By 1937, this number had doubled to 112, and it was still the fourth largest Protestant denomination in terms of foreign missionary employment, trailing behind the China Inland Mission, the Presbyterian North, and the combined board of foreign missions of the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Women's Foreign Missionary Society American Methodist. The positive portrayal of missionary prospects in China continued into the 1930s, especially after the anti-Christian movement had run its course. On January 1930, K.H. Wood wrote in the review that the Seventh-day Adventist Church in China had suffered greatly during the last 2 years from the anti-foreign and anti-Christian agitation that accompanied the recent revolution. However, he went on to note the prospects before the church were never brighter than now. The reforms of the nationalist government are opening up the country to more extensive communications and in many ways are preparing the people to receive the gospel message. Religious liberty has been declared to all Christians. And positive reports such as this are a regular feature in the pages of the review throughout the 1930s, indicating the denomination's commitment to mission in China. Although some Seventh-day Adventist authors recognised that there was a need to indigenize the leadership of the church in China, there was never a debate within the denomination as to whether or not the foreign missionary program should continue, that we see in other denominations, especially the Methodists. A report from C.C. Chrysler, who was Secretary of the China Division in 1931, made particular mention of the latest ordination of men to professional ministry, which, quote, had balanced the majority of our ordained ministry on the side of the native men. Now the balance is on the right side, and we rejoice in this evidence of progress. L.E. Christman, also writing in the review, noted that it was felt on the part of some that the outstanding need at the present time is to establish our schools for the training of native leadership to work in a country and language which is theirs amid customs which are familiar. And this was then used as a rationale for the Mission Extension Fund to provide should be to follow up, train, educate and develop the product brought into the church by the Chinese workers. It's very evident to us that foreign missionaries still play a very important part as evangelists in bringing souls into our churches in these mission lands. So the contrast between these authors' viewpoints demonstrates that the Adventist Church saw a place for both foreign and Indigenous leadership in the mission fields, and that there was also a variety of attitudes within the church towards missionary roles. However, at no time was there a sense in denominational literature that foreign missionaries should be withdrawn entirely or that they were no longer necessary. In addition to the continued promotion of the need for foreign missionary service, the discourse surrounding China in the review during this time period also reinforced the Church's eschatological position. The review regularly exegeted the doctrines of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. References to the eschatological portion of Seventh-day Adventist theology occurred regularly within the pages of the magazine. An example of this type of article is The Second Advent, The Only Hope, written by F.D. Nicol, which appeared in April 1931. While it did not specifically discuss the situation in China, the article contributed to the framework through which Seventh-day Adventists viewed the world and world events. Furthermore, the importance that the Church placed on eschatology can be seen in the name of their meeting hall in Hankow, which is fairly typical, Jin Shi Tang, Warning the World Hall. Discourse about conditions in China served as confirmation of Seventh-day Adventist doctrine within the broader church community. In 1931, Frederick Lee reported on an evangelistic campaign held in Hankow. The Lord is preparing to finish his work quickly in China. And there had been an upsurge of interest from prospective converts since the anti-Christian movement had ended. Reflecting the Seventh-day Adventist belief that they were holders of a special truth, Lee proposed that the denomination had an advantage over what he termed the nominal Christian churches, anything else. Lee explicitly references a theological concept unique to Seventh-day Adventism by stating that the third angel's message is progressing. He positions this distinctive doctrine as providing the church with an advantage over other denominations because he believed that the Seventh-day Adventist message provided the answers that the Chinese people were looking for. Furthermore, Seventh-day Adventist audiences reading Lee's description of conditions in China, famine, turmoil, civil war, would immediately draw a connection to Matthew 24:6 in the Bible, which foretells these events as a sign of the end. In conclusion, Seventh-day Adventist eschatology predisposed the church membership to expect persecution, and therefore when troubles occurred for the church in China, they were seen as being a fulfillment of prophecy and a sign that the time of the end was approaching. Because of this worldview, the response was not to withdraw the missionaries or slow down the speed of evangelism, but rather to pour more resources and efforts into the region in order to warn as many people as possible of the soon coming of Jesus Christ. This belief was a key motivator in the selection of China as the recipient of the Week of Sacrifice offering in 1927. This eschatological theology differentiated Seventh-day Adventists from other Protestant denominations. Discussions regarding the role of missionaries and the connection between missionaries and imperialism, which occurred in other denominations during this time period, I found no evidence in the review. I found no evidence in internal letters between China and the GC. It's not there. If it happened off the record, but my feeling is that it wasn't even on anybody's radar. Furthermore, the hierarchical structure of the Seventh-day Adventist Church meant that programs developed by church administrators, such as fundraising appeals and special offerings, were more readily accepted in individual congregations than in denominations which followed a more congregational model of administration. So the church was able to fundraise in a more coordinated manner. However, the Seventh-day Adventists were not alone in their support for missions in China. Varg points out that during the 1930s, conservative churches faced the problem of declining contributions due to the economic depression, but they fared much better than the liberal denominations in maintaining a missionary force in China. As a conservative church, the Seventh-day Adventists were therefore also following a pattern evident in other conservative denominations.
Good morning. Church of Dangerous Historians. You know, as I've been sitting there and just wondering how dangerous the history is. People have asked me the question, am I an historian? No, I'm not. What brings me to this convention? I just happened by pure coincidence to listen to David's presentation of history as my morning devotional, and I just saw that invitation for a call for papers, which I responded to. I said, well, that's very interesting, Situating Adventist History. I didn't know really what I was getting into. I said, well, I'll write something. So I write something this morning, and I sent it. Forgot about it until I got a letter saying, okay, you need to present your paper, and I kind of thinking, well, you know, what I'm going to present. My initial motivation was, well, you know, whenever we talk about Adventist history, we often look at it from a Euro or North American perspective. And I kind of said, well, Adventism is a global movement, has had different operations at different time in history. What about if we look at it from a different perspective? And that's what I'm going to do this morning, looking at it from colonial, a colonial perspective. Just before I introduce my paper also, my interest in history rose very early. I had for mentor, some of you may know Arthur Patrick, and a good friend. In my earlier years at college, at Avondale College, he was kind of very kind, helping us to go through the theological crisis that was happening in Australia at that time. So I was happy to see him and his picture at the historian at the archives yesterday. So, and through Arthur, I got to know through their writings what I call the icon, Ron Graybill and Gilbert Valentine, and I'm happy to see this icon of Adventist historians here today. Thank you very much. So, it's very hard for a preacher to stand behind a mic, so I tend to walk around. So, anyway, so this comes out. Yeah. So, briefly, Seventh-day Adventist history is embedded in its mission history. And these histories are distinct, but not separated. It is not a question of either or, but both and. They are the faces of a single coin, and it all depends at which face of the coin we are looking at and how we are looking at it. So the historical studies and historians of Seventh-day Adventist, of Adventism as a global religious phenomenon, accounts for the diverse social, political, cultural, and economic realities in which its mission emerges and develops, using socio-economic and political paradigms to understand the different contextual historical reality of a global religious phenomenon. For their part, mission historians undertake the critical analysis of the origin and the development of the church mission, its evangelism work, its health, education, humanitarian work, from within a particular philosophical and eschatological vision or version, and though this version and vision may be socially constructed. I'm not going to look at the Indian Seventh-day Adventist history from this mission history perspective or the eschatological perspective this morning. But I do believe that, in a sense, our mission history invests our denominational global history with a sense of purpose and meaning. I'll leave it at that and leave it to the mission historians to continue the work. So Seventh-day Adventist denominational history and its mission history blends, reveals a delightful spectrum of colors, varied contours, changing textures, multiple layers. Alice Kessler Harris points out history is a moving spectacle depending on our lookout position. So consequently, our aim is to look at a part of a global history of Seventh-day Adventism from a particular perspective, that is the colonial context. So there's limitation, obviously. I'm limited by time, resources, and suppose the main question that I would like to look at from this perspective, to which extent Seventh-day Adventism, its denominational history, absorb, transforms, or collaborate with colonial powers of the day. So the answer, therefore, is limited to time and resources, and an amplified and complete answer will obviously require full-time research and financial means to investigate primary sources and gather sufficient data to draw valid conclusions. Therefore, given the limitations I face, I've delimited this study to a specific period and place in the history of the Seventh-day Adventist organization, namely Indian Seventh-day Adventist Church history from 1920 to 1947, which later I'll explain, the context of British colonization. My sources are primary sources for understanding the extent of colonial influence on the Indian Seventh-day Adventist Church during the pre-independence periods are the articles published in the main periodicals of the SDA Church. The Oriental Watchman and Herald of Health are kind of an equivalent of A Vibrant Life, and the Eastern Tidings would be probably an Adventist review for the South Eastern Division. So I'm relying on those two documents, and I'm examining the views advocated in these periodicals in regard to matters pertaining to education, health, religion, and will propose that the substance of these articles present evidence that the SDA Indian Seventh-day Adventist Church, through educational work, health services, evangelism, actively and silently resisted the ideology of the dominant powers, whether foreign or national, which stood up against the particular interests of dominant powers and unjust social structures. And such, therefore, texts, Oriental Watchman and Eastern Tidings, are texts for me of non-violent resistance, which open the possibility for history to be written from below and not necessarily and always from the privileged status of the victors. So the objective of this paper, entitled Indian Seventh-day Adventist History, the context of British colonization, proposes to look at the historical setting of the Indian Seventh-day Adventist Church from the perspective of the socio-economic and political condition of colonization prevailing in India from 1920 and 1947. By the way, I don't know much about India, right? So the only reason I chose India, I just wanted to go far, far away and not hear about Ellen White and all the Adventist history surrounding that. So I fled to this like Jonah, but wait until the end, and Jonah is going to be rebuked. So this period of Indian church history unfolded in the British colonial context, characterized by the rise of the uplift mass movement initiated by Mahatma Gandhi. So I want to locate Seventh-day Adventist history within that larger colonial context of the rise of the uplift mass movement, which I'm going to explain. So the uplift movement served the double purpose of strengthening the nationalist movement initiated by Gandhi himself, the national movement ideal for self-government and economic self-sufficiency. So we argue that the Indian Seventh-day Adventist Church, through its publishing, educational, and medical enterprise, jumped on the bandwagon, maybe capitalized on its own terms. And this is very important, that they capitalized on their own terms, on the rise of the uplift movement, and developed its own brand and put its own signature to the secular nationalist uplift mass movement. So we're going to look at the significance of this presentation, Indian Seventh-day Adventist Church historiography, and the heterogeneous phase of the colonial context, and then we're going to insert the Indian Seventh-day Adventist history in the context of the uplift mass movement under the dual form of government that was shared between the imperial power, the British Raj, the British rule, and the provincial Indian government. So, okay, significance of this study. Number one, an important part of the global history of Seventh-day Adventism unfolded in the context of colonization, which prevailed in mostly all regions in the world: Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, the Caribbean, not excluding for a period of time North America. And secondly, many Seventh-day Adventist world leaders and corporate decision makers have emerged from colonial and post-colonial nations and are the natural product of the history of Seventh-day Adventist Mission in the colonial and post-colonial setting. Thirdly, the global history of Seventh-day Adventism under colonization has been forgotten. And fourthly, the significance of these studies is to reframe the global history of Seventh-day Adventism within the context of colonization and post-colonial historiography. It calls for a shift in the interpretation of past events which have impacted Seventh-day Adventism in many nations under colonial rule. So I'm not going to look at all the different colonial areas where Seventh-day Adventists are. I'm just focusing on India. So the second aspect is the finish with the significance. I want to look at the Indian Seventh-day Adventist Church historiography. It is there a historiography for the Indian Seventh-day Adventist Church. How historians have attempted to interpret history in that time. So Indian Seventh-day Adventist Church historiography is scarce. But I found that maybe we could say there have been two ways of interpreting that, and mine is a third way. So the first ways of interpreting Indian Seventh-day Adventistry is what I call a thick description of the church. It's a unique genre which can best be described as a narration of living experiences of Christian Adventist missionaries. So these writings of great ethnological resource, by the way. So, but these writings locate the geographical location of a school, a church, the name and kind of work of the pioneers in an area, their success, their challenge, their opportunities, their weaknesses, their failures, but also the faith consciousness which drives those missionaries and the believers forward. And that kind of thick description and interpretation of Indian history is found like in Spalding, Richard Schwartz, Emma Howell. Even Schwartz writes, the missionary character is evidenced in the reports of daily experiences in every one of them. However, the narrative of those living experiences can be considered as thick description of local grassroots historical realities, probably a history of the periphery, a marginal knowledge, as Moffat in his volume 2 of Christian History says. There is a kind of a marginal knowledge that arises from an intersubjective understanding of history shared between the missionaries and the converts. So, we'll run through that. It's very interesting that in 1927, the Educational Council took a vote, and here is the vote, that a brief summary of the history of our work in India be prepared to supplement the courses of denominational history for India, and that we asked Jess James to prepare the material. This vote is quite significant because it showed the intention and ambition to contextualize the Indian dimension of the Seventh-day Adventist Church history and to differentiate it from denominational history at large. So it was difficult to verify the outcome of this vote through the available resources. An email was sent to a person in the Southern Asian division, but there was no reply to see if James did write a local history of the church compared to a denominational history. But apart from these narrative living experiences, there has been a turn from text to images in Indian history writing. So there was a turn in the writing of the Indian church history in the 90s. The centennial celebration of the Indian Seventh-day Adventist Church, 1893-1993, of the Indian Church provided the opportunity for the church leadership to present a new historical discourse on the Seventh-day Adventist Church history in India. So the general manager of the publishing house, the Oriental Watchman publishing house, P.H. Lyle, says, as he wrote that book called Images, a partial review of the century, their commitment, our challenge. That's what the manager said. He says, there are a few limitations in writing this book. We did not have a well-developed sense of the history of the church. Information was fragmentary, incomplete. Therefore, it was necessary for us to cross-check and verify facts and clarify issues. And secondly, the information received was most often biased. And then he concludes, a representation of the past is not complete unless we see both sides of the coins. What is interesting with that turn is that they try to represent the Indian history of the Seventh-day Adventist Church through the medium of photography. So the photos were organized under 7 main periods covering the organizational of the Indian church: the early years, the formative years, the foundational years, the expansional years, maturing years, the reorganizing years, and the challenging years. For me, the images, that book offered a shift in the way we can look at Indian Seventh-day Adventist history, which was different from the living experience narrative. It was an attempt not only to represent a point of view of the historical development of the Indian Seventh-day Adventist history through selected photographs, but also to frame this perspective within 7 distinct phases of organizational development. So Indian Seventh-day Adventist historiography has been marked firstly by a thick description of the local living intersubjective experiences and an organizational developmental approach of the Indian Seventh-day Adventist Church history. How much time have I got?
You've got about 6 minutes.
Okay, I'll run through that. So basically, when I spoke about the colonial context, we need to understand the heterogeneous character of that context. Colonialism, of course, was not a unified phenomenon, as Catherine Hall says in Cultures of Empire. There were the colonialism associated with the different European empires and the different forms of colonialism which operated within the British Empire. And she said that different mission organizations, travelers, merchants, traders, soldiers, sailors, farmers, prostitutes, teachers, officials, and missionaries all were engaged in colonial relations with their own particular dynamics. So we have bracketed the Indian Seventh-day Adventist history in the context of the Uplift Mass movement. So the Uplift, I'm shortening that. So the Uplift movement, Salvadoria, was a political posture, a national movement of non-violent resistance. What Gandhi calls the Satyagraha. So the Uplift movement was called Salvadoria, which is welfare for all. This uplift movement gained its impetus and philosophical inspiration from Gandhi's concept of Salvadoria, meaning uplift and welfare for all. Salva, one and all, Ude, welfare or uplift. According to the Gandhi Research Foundation, Salvadoria for Gandhi and India, this meant grassroots level uplift, which began from the villages and from the most deprived classes, and then rose up to cover the upper lying social strata. So, because I'm running short of time, I just want to say that this uplift movement was a peaceful movement which together with Satyagraha, insistence on truth, non-violence resistance, constituted a powerful but peaceful force of resistance against the British Raj, and there were other movements also, like the All Indian Spinners Association, the All Indian Village Industries, the Cow Service Society, and other Christian mission societies. And all these were involved in the infamous civilizing doctrine of Macaulay, which aimed to create a nation Indian in blood and color, but British in taste, in opinions, in morals, and intellects. So how did Seventh-day Adventists met that? So on January 15, 1923, the Eastern Tidings published a special edition, Uplift a Special 1923. This edition highlighted through photograph the implementations of Uplift schools, Uplift projects, printing, agriculture, sewing in various villages of India. In February 1930, this time, the Oriental Watchman and Herald of Health issued a special edition of Uplift entitled A Special Uplift Number for Education and Medical Work. I've got a lot of quotation there showing how the Adventists participated in the Uplift movement. For example, in January 15, 1923, McHenry, in his article, writes, Nizam's government is doing much to better the conditions by establishing schools, hospitals in the larger centers. But since the greatest share of the millions of India live in the villages, dotting the countryside, only the surface is touched from these large centers. The masses should be reached. And Loseby, in his article, January 1923, speaks about a practical uplift work. In all those quotations, the word uplift is mentioned. Even in 1930, Cormac, in the special edition of the Oriental Watchman, qualified hospitals and dispensaries as uplifting agencies. And I can go on, but I'll make my conclusion there, saying that Seventh-day Adventists engage on its own terms. So, though the church worked for the welfare of all, it did so like other self-civilizing mission organizations within a frame of differentiation and incorporation, as Yana Shureneff has argued. All British subjects were included in a vast universal project of civilization to transform humanity, cure the evil, improve the uplift, but it was also differentiated. It was defined by an interplay of the categories of race or culture, class, and gender. This is reflected in Loseby in the Eastern Tidings magazine, where Loseby says, okay, girls should be included. The education we're giving them is purely academic, but they are limited to domestic science, home training, and motherhood. So missionaries, philanthropic association, government councils, all were participating agents at varying degree. So this paper has shown key areas, the medical and educational, where the SDA Church collaborated, participated on its own terms through a process of incorporation and differentiation, an economic movement inspired by Mahatma Gandhi concept of Salvadoria, whose ultimate aim was to accelerate the process of self-government, abolish the diarchy, dual government, and affirm economic self-sufficiency for the masses. There's a very interesting story with, it's very interesting that a quick count of the term uplift in the writings of Ellen G. White, remember I said Jonah didn't want to meet Ellen White, but finally gave 684 results. My conclusion, it belongs to our mission historians to show the extent the Indian Seventh-day Adventist Church history and its participation in the Indian uplift movement was indebted to the theological significance and usage of this term in the practical history of salvation. Kessler Harris points out, history is a moving spectacle. Over the past 2 decades or so, we have come to understand that the worldview of historians necessarily emanates from the world in which he or she lives, and that our views of past may well be conditioned by our relationship to the present. If all history is present history, famously put it, then the past is a moving spectacle.
Good morning. We travel from India back to North America, and in 1890 George Butler, former president of the GC, wrote, "City life is a feverish life. It is not conducive to calm thought, religious meditation, needed rest, cool nerves, and quiet contemplations. Cities have ever been and will ever be Satan's peculiar seat. We do not see how anyone with right views can love city life. We turn from it gladly to contemplate the quiet charms of country life." And in his 2-article series, he concluded, "The blessed new earth, the final home of the redeemed, will be the perfection of holy, peaceful, happy country life." Of course, the irony is that the picture in Revelation is very much an urban picture with a New Jerusalem. And in this paper, I want to briefly outline some of the context that brought this sort of a statement to take place. I mean, Butler did not exist in an Adventist bubble. And as we look at Adventist history in North America, we see that in many ways the church has subverted dominant discourses, but in other ways the Adventist church has shown itself a child of its times. It's reflected and echoed attitudes and practices of society in general, Protestant churches in particular, and evangelical churches more specifically, especially as expressed through the holiness movement started within the Methodist Church. So we can see this shared emphasis on shared emphasis on godly behaviour, and in the stereotyping, fear, and avoidance of cities. In reflecting the wider Protestant world's preference for rural living, the Adventist Church has developed a dominant discourse that supports this preference. And an important part of this discourse is that cities are unhealthful places in which to live, they're sources of moral temptation, and they're potentially injurious to the spiritual life. So this immediately places the Adventist Church in a stance that is unfavourable to urban engagement, and it predisposes it to a theologically and missiologically weak response to the need for urban mission. And just a casual survey of the array of current expressions of this discourse in different videos on YouTube, official and unofficial publications, various independent Adventist ministries, shows it's a tribute to the endurance and resilience of that anti-city discourse. The Second Great Awakening of the early 1800s led evangelicals to an understanding of faith as something practical and personal that influences every aspect of people's lives. The holiness movement emphasized the new way of life that must accompany conversion, continuing to obey God's laws and living piously. And familiar echoes of these revivalist and holiness strains are found in Jonathan Butler's description of how Ellen White, quote, shaped Adventism into a domestic religion with her concern for child nurture and education, diet and health, marriage and family. And naturally, a theology that emphasized personal behavior had implications for how Christians should treat their neighbors and communities, and naturally, Protestants wanted to share this message of revival in the rapidly growing cities of America. Yet, as Paul Boyer writes, Protestantism found it exceptionally difficult to keep pace with the urban surge. The influence that they had in the small villages and towns of North America could not be replicated in the growing cities. And of course, a large part of the challenge was that Christian resources, churches, clergymen, and even church members were located in rural areas. So as the Adventist Church fixed its eyes on Christ's soon return and a promised new earth, it still had to continue dealing with the old earth. And the earth that Adventists preferred was the grass and soil of the farm, not the concrete and structural steel of the city. The group of faithful believers who nearly 20 years after the Great Disappointment formed themselves into the Seventh-day Adventist Church managed to harness the religious fervour and expectation of the Millerite movement. They managed to revive the expectation of a soon return of Jesus as a central pillar of its identity, and even added the word Adventist to its name. And this continued emphasis on the second coming has played a significant role in many ways in Adventist attitudes to and work within urban areas. This tension between preparing for the second coming, with the expectation of Jesus setting everything right, with the call to occupy until he comes, has helped shape Adventist Mission in general and Adventist urban mission in particular. It may seem ironic, but it should not be surprising that a denomination can promote mission to the cities as urgent in the light of Christ's soon coming, while simultaneously spending billions of dollars each year on establishing and maintaining this worldly institutions such as schools, hospitals, universities, and even more ironically, aged care facilities. The entire international mission program of the Adventist Church was built on the imperative to proclaim Adventist truths, lead people to baptism, and then membership of the church. And this evangelistic emphasis, with its focus on personal salvation, was reinforced during the early part of the 20th century as Adventists found themselves spiritual, if not actual, soulmates with the so-called fundamentalist movement. We know that the fundamentalists rejected Adventists as being a dangerous cult, but Adventists turned the other cheek and cheered from the sidelines. In 1929, in an editorial in the Adventist Review and Sabbath Herald, Elder Wilcox wrote that Adventists, with their strong belief in the sacredness of the divine word, should, quote, count themselves the chief of fundamentalists today. In the following years, despite a wide variety of Adventist humanitarian, educational and health endeavours, public proclamation and the measurement of success through baptisms continued to be the main measure of what Adventists would call success. The end of the American Civil War marked the beginning of a period that Mark Twain described aptly as the Gilded Age. The title captures the essence of a new urban industrial America where the dollar would reign supreme, where capital and production would dominate the landscape, and where surface prosperity and abundance would dazzle. And the burgeoning cities became a symbol of the times, places of opportunity, choice and growth. They also came to epitomise fears among many rural dwellers, mostly religious, of the pernicious influence of urban areas. The rapid growth of the cities within a generation was unfamiliar, it was perplexing and even frightening for American Protestants because their worldview had been framed and shaped in rural contexts. The cities brought new complexities that churches were ill prepared to navigate. In the noise of the new American city, how was the Christian voice going to be heard? How could churches compete with amusements and entertainments designed to capture the leisure time of urban dwellers? How could churches address the overwhelmingly negative social fallout of the industrial age, the poor, the unemployed, the orphans? And how should the church relate to the foreign voices, cultures, languages, and even religions being imported through millions of new immigrants flooding the cities? In 1885, clergyman Josiah Strong published a book entitled Our Country. He wrote, quote, "The city is the nerve centre of our civilization. It is also the storm centre. In fact," he adds, "there is no more serious menace to our civilization than our rabble-ruled cities." The book proved a bestseller, but it merely reflected what was widely being preached from pulpits, both religious and political, and published in magazines and popular literature of the day. The city stood for chaos and menace, lack of structure and order, the exact reverse of the uniformity, predictability, and safety of rural life. Strong published his book during America's Third Great Awakening, a period of religious revival which, not coincidentally, roughly matches the dates for the Gilded Age. And this religious awakening was largely in response to the disillusionment with the negative social byproducts of the new urban era. The new industrial capital lined the pockets of the Gilded Age's robber barons and others, while inevitably other citizens were, quote, left behind. In the 1894 novel With the Procession, a young lawyer describes Chicago, quote, "You'll find a hell broth, thieves, gamblers, prostitutes, pawnbrokers, saloon keepers, aldermen, healers, justices, bailiffs, policemen, and all concocted for us within a short quarter of a century. At an 1888 ecumenical conference on the religious condition of New York City, a Mr. Van Norden stated that, quote, "A majority of our urban populations constitute an uneducated, irreligious, and in many cases a vicious mass." At the same conference, another delegate stated that, quote, "The foreign element was largely responsible for the vice and crime in the cities. Immigrants made up a majority of the labour force in cities such as New York, Chicago and Detroit by 1910. Most of them were Roman Catholic and they, quote, "appeared to subvert the civil and religious institutions of the country." This marriage of the cities with Catholic immigrants lifted rural Protestant fears yet another notch. So the dominant Protestant discourse in America about cities has framed them as negative, places to avoid, and from that it has framed them as places in need of rescue. And the vision of how that rescue should take place has had many different responses, but has tended to divide down theological lines into two main approaches. One seen more commonly among more liberal Protestants and the other among more conservative and fundamentalist varieties. And according to Matthew Bauman, both approaches were pastoral responses to the phenomenon of the city. So on the one hand, we have the conservative evangelicals who tended to see urban rescue in terms of personal evangelism, leading individuals to conversion, accepting Jesus as their saviour. According to this approach, when people are converted, their lives will be transformed, they'll become better people, they'll treat people with kindness and behave morally, which will lead them to be a positive influence on urban communities. It's kind of like trickle-down economics. Adventists have generally aligned more closely with this approach, where its involvement in any direct social action would be best described as social care. So under this umbrella comes the theme of moral uplift, and under this umbrella could come things such as rescue missions for alcoholics, prostitutes, the homeless and the hungry. But underlying it all is the premise that all such activities are just temporary alleviance until the second coming of Jesus, which will finally and properly set all things right. The second response to the need of the cities, the second offer of rescue, aligns more closely with what has been termed the social gospel. This is a theological approach and a historic Protestant movement that focuses less on personal moral failings and the need for individual salvation and more on addressing structures that support social oppression, economic injustice, and corrupt or oppressive systems. While also promoting various types of social care, the social gospel goes further in its willingness to critique oppressive systems and institutions and to politically advocate for those who are marginalised. In America, the social gospel approach has almost exclusively been an urban movement. It hasn't gathered any traction in the South or in the rural areas. Post-millennialist in theology and representing more mainline and liberal wings of Protestantism, this approach centres urban ministry on building a representative kingdom of God on earth. Of course, concern for the poor, the needy, the marginalised stretches right back to the ancient Jewish prophets, but the term social gospel has a specific meaning in the American context. It was largely an attempt to provide a Christian response to the dislocation and rapid changes to the fabric of American society brought about by the rapid urbanisation and industrialisation of the late 19th century. For social gospel advocates, such things as revival meetings, altar calls, and even soup kitchens for the homeless were not a sufficient moral response to these urban challenges. They felt that the negative fallout from such a turbulent time required more than band-aid solutions, and they were not prepared to blame it all on the breakdown of personal morality. In many ways, liberal Protestantism met with tremendous success during these years. Susan Jacoby refers to, quote, the extraordinary decline in religious literalism and says that it was understandable that many observers prematurely declared fundamentalism dead in the 1920s. But in fact, it was in the 1920s that fundamentalism would find its theological legs, its strident anti-modernist voice, and launch a movement whose legacy is still a significant influence in American society, politics, and religion. Conservative and fundamentalist forms of Christianity in America have tended to be more pessimistic about what can be accomplished to fix social problems on earth. And while there's a strong evangelical tradition, and indeed Adventist tradition, of being involved in social care, there's often an underlying fear that such activities could distract from the more important issues of individual salvation and the second coming of Jesus. At the 1888 Protestant Ecumenical Conference on the Religious Condition of New York City, the Reverend Richard Hartley reported on Baptist missions in the city. He argued that there were worse things than not having a roof over one's head and wearing a ragged coat, being outside God's kingdom and not being clothed in the robe of Christ's righteousness. He said, "I think that men need to be taught that a guilty soul is worse than an empty stomach." Although the rise of the social gospel in the early 20th century was largely a response to urban social problems, it was also a reaction against an increasing intellectualization of the theological enterprise. It was an attempt to put feet on the ground for the Christian message. Likewise, although the rise of Protestant fundamentalism in the 1920s was a reaction to development in the sciences and biblical interpretation, it was also a declaration of the primacy of evangelization and, quote, soul winning. This tension between these two forms of rescue has helped frame a central debate within evangelical circles that continues today, and it has direct relevance for how holistic urban missions should be conducted. As two evangelical academics wrote last year, quote, "The perennial debate as to whether evangelism shall have priority over social action has led to a lack of conceptual clarity and loss of direction in Christian integral mission." The term social gospel was adapted, caricatured, reframed, and enlisted in the service of a variety of agendas. In the hands of some, it came to stand for virtually any type of social care that distracted from the central task of evangelization. In the heady climate of the modernist fundamentalist debate, even benign social care began to be tainted with a kind of guilt by association with the dreaded social gospel. As a result, David Jones says, for much of the 20th century, evangelicals, quote, shied away from the social implication of the gospel. This was driven by fear of being labelled and of being judged theologically unorthodox. I don't have time to elaborate it this morning, but I did a discourse analysis of the use of the word social gospel in the Adventist Review, and almost 100% it is used in a negative way, and if it's referenced even positively, it comes with some sort of a disclaimer. In the late 19th and early 20th century, we see a period of holistic city mission in America run by the Adventist Church. But by the early 1900s, we see how the dominant discourse about cities, combined with the emphasis on public evangelism, almost totally sidelines the social engagement narrative within Adventism. Again, I don't have time this morning, but social engagement in the cities was substantial on behalf of Adventists in the late 19th century, with city missions, including the Chicago Medical Mission. But the Adventist turn from social engagement was well consolidated by the 1920s, and the associated rise of the fundamentalist movement provided a well-equipped vehicle to help carry the momentum of Adventism's move away from social engagement in urban mission. Although some urban social ministry continued, it was a side stream of the main current of direct Adventist evangelistic preaching. So in more recent history, we see that fundamentalists grew in strength, but then, and there was a rift between the left and the right in Protestant circles, but from the civil rights and anti-war movements of the 1960s, we saw a new generation of socially aware evangelicals arise, and we've seen recent critiques of the dominant discourse within evangelicalism recently coming through such movements as the emerging movement. We've also seen the new monastics, and we see a turn toward trying to reclaim some of that lost ground. David Swartz argues that the academic community has too readily assumed that evangelicals fit uniformly in a traditionalist and politically conservative box. And so we see evidence of progressive impulses through Sojourners, Evangelicals for Social Action, etc. In conclusion, Adventist engagement in urban areas has reflected and been conditioned by wider socio-historical forces. It has built a dominant discourse about the cities that reflects that of other American Protestants. And for much of its history, it has shortchanged its urban mission, relying on proclamation of the Adventist message rather than the holistic approach Ellen White describes as Christ's method of ministry. Although this is not appropriate in delivering a history paper, I take the liberty to suggest that if the Adventist Church is to move forward with integrity and relevance, it must deconstruct its dominant discourse about the cities and see them as full of people God loves, and find ways to seek their shalom. And while never losing its focus on the importance of individual salvation, it must also find ways to reach back into the resources of the more holistic approach advocated by Ellen White, supported by its theology, and modelled in its earlier history. Although it has rightly rejected a hard-lined, exclusivist social gospel, Adventism's theology and its historic roots should compel its future urban mission to demonstrate that the gospel is not just words and propositions, but must have definite social implications and make a tangible difference in people's lives. The gospel must be good news for the totality of the lives of urban dwellers. Thank you.
Thanks. I think all three of these papers touch on to what extent Adventists are apolitical, as Alex's presentation yesterday brought about, talked to us about, and even, to what extent apocalyptic movements participate in political nationalist projects like Keith was talking about. Are there any questions? I certainly have some, but I'm happy, in the interest of our shortened time this morning. Yes, Gil?
I have an observation for Lindsay, if I may. Lindsay, you addressed your study to the 1920s to 1947, but your paper this morning answered a question for me in a very interesting way. I spent 5 years in Pakistan, just across the border, and 40 years after partition, we were still using Uplift as the title of the ingathering campaign. And I wondered at the time why that was.
Yes.
But we would go to Muslim businessmen
Yes.
and ask them to support the Uplift campaign for the year, and they were willing to do so.
Yeah, if I may respond to that, that's correct.
Thanks, Gary.
This was a fundraising campaign. They used the label of it to fundraise our equivalent of in-gathering, basically. So that's very interesting that they continue that.
Doug?
Yes, just to follow up on that, I wanted to clarify at the end where you referred to all of Ellen White's usage of Uplift. Was that to indicate that, with regard to India, then, that they were attuned to that word, and so it predisposed them to adapt that from the India Uplift Mission, or was your point more that maybe it came from Ellen White rather than from the social context?
Basically, I think it's the second thing. I was saying it's not for me to establish that. It's for mission historians to establish whether there is a link with Ellen White in that regard. So,
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
Question for Gary. Thank you so much for your paper, Gary, and as you know, I lean towards social gospel and have been for many, many years, decades, both in my writing and in my teaching and preaching. Glad that I have one of my students, former students here, who is now pastor, who is implementing that. And I wanted to ask you, have you considered the African American church in North America that is predominantly urban church and has had a significant influence within the context of social justice, as Dr. Morgan has written and published in his books on a number of people who are involved with that kind of project, how does that feature into the overall Adventist movement, and can you say anything about it, please?
Yeah, I've looked a little bit at it, Zach. They had the great migration of American blacks up into the northern cities, and the churches, including Adventist churches, became quite a useful tool in helping to resituate and to acclimatize the migrants to the cities. And so, of all within the Adventist faith, I would say the African American community in North America has taken much more of a social stance in the cities, and in fact, often within the writings that you see of the time, urban or city is code for black. But having said that, many times the black churches acted actually as islands in their midst and were actually not even connected with their communities. So it's a mixed bag. But those impetuses that we see that are more toward the social gospel, I would say, come more strongly from the black church.
Okay, Michelle and then Dave.
Thank you for those papers. I have two questions. The first one is for Ruth, and I'm wondering how the church in China compared to the church in Manchukuo. In Manchukuo, which was Manchuria, colonized by Japan. If the Adventist attitude toward the government and the regime was different in Manchuria when it was colonized by the Japanese, where I think the attitude towards missionaries was quite harsh. And then the second question that I have is, I guess for both Lindsay and Ruth, and particularly going off of Ruth's paper where you talked about the eschatological beliefs and how that shaped the Adventist mission in China. Do you have any sense, either of you, how Adventist eschatological beliefs were received within the colonial context? You talked about the attitude that I guess American or Western Adventists had. Do you have a sense from the sources that you've read how that shaped native, quote-unquote native attitudes towards the colonial context?
So in Manchukuo, I know the church started building a hospital at the bequest of Jiang Shuiliang, the young marshal. When he was driven out by the Japanese, the church completed that hospital and ran it under Japanese auspices anyway. There was also great debate during the 1930s after Paul Quimby had finished working in the school for Chiang Kai-shek and Madam Chiang Kai-shek. The church looked at sending him to Manchuria, and an old retired Chinese missionary actually wrote to the General Conference and said, "Are you guys insane? The Japanese know that he worked for the Chiangs. Do you know how badly it's going to go for him if you send him up there? Because of his close alliance with the nationalist government, you're sending him into the Japanese territory." And so Quimby ended up not returning to that position. So the church continued to operate within not just Manchuria, but within Japanese-occupied China for the duration of the Second World War. Once the Pacific War started with Japan and America, American missionaries were withdrawn and leadership was handed over to indigenous Chinese leaders and also German missionaries who were able to remain within occupied China because Japan and Germany were allies. So the church doesn't seem to have suffered terribly. We have records along a similar line saying the church in Manchuria is going ahead. We have new converts, we have fine new church buildings, and even the Methodists have noticed this because they've published about us in their magazine, contrasting the great Adventist work with the stalled Methodist work. They actually quote the Methodist Journal in that regard to show how well Adventist missionary activity is going in Japan. If you look at one of the things that the Adventists did on occasion was they would list where their converts, this is the second part of your question, they would list where their converts came from. And often in a village, the majority of the converts were already Christian. So Adventists earned the title sheep stealers within the Chinese context because they would go into a village and steal the sheep that were already Christian. And often there's a list I saw where there's like one converted from heathenism and then the other 12 come from Presbyterian, Methodist, China Inland Mission, which would indicate that the local people, the indigenous people, found the Adventist message appealing in some sense. And there was very much, the reading that I've done indicates that maybe not the eschatology, but the lifestyle factors of Adventism were appealing because it was a way that you could demonstrate that you were doing something. It's almost like a salvation by works. You know, you stop eating pork, you stop participating in temple rites, you start to worship on the Sabbath, you stop contributing to the community temple fund and that sort of thing, in a way that the other Protestant denominations didn't quite require. But I don't read Chinese, and most of the resources that we have are lost, so it's very hard to find the Chinese voice within the sources. If you're really interested in that question, I'd recommend you get in touch with Bruce Lowe, who has quite an extensive collection of Chinese language material that's held at the Centre for Study of Adventism in China in Hong Kong.
Lindsay, did you want to address the
just,
eschatology question?
I just would like to address your question at two levels. The first level, in terms of the eschatological inspiration, yes, there's an abundance of materials, especially in the Oriental Watchmen, that missionary enterprise were inspired by an eschatological vision. But I don't argue for that myself. I'm saying at a deeper level is for the mission historians to look at the extent to which it was inspired through an eschatological vision. I look at the fact of the movement, the uplift movement, as just a social constructed movement that happened in a very specific time of history. So I don't look at it from the faith perspective.
David, do you have a question?
Well, this is a sort of an observation, but one which I would like people to respond, and it's really addressed to all three, which is that drawing from the first two papers, I was making the note that Adventists seem to have the tendency to appropriate or assimilate concepts and rhetoric to their own religious worldview in a very interesting and flexible way. So negative events in China become positive when you see them through the lens of the apocalyptic interpretation, and Indian nationalist rhetoric, I think because it's rhetoric Adventists use very well, they can assimilate it very readily. And yet Gary's paper seems to suggest the opposite, that their Adventists are much more wary of anything that gets called the social gospel, even though this is an incredibly ill-defined subject. But once you put the tar of social gospel or something, then nobody wishes to be dirtied with that. So would you I think that's an observation. I would invite some response from the group, and maybe actually Ruth and Lindsay would see some ways in which there is a resistance, such as Gary, or maybe Gary will say, no, actually I think I see the same thing. So that's for all three panelists.
Go first, sir?
Yeah, Gary, do you have an idea of why?
Well, I think Adventists have always been opportunist and taken the opportunities where they can, but we're also very happy to take on the fundamentalist label, but we weren't prepared to take on the social gospel label. So I think within mine, I don't really see too much of a trend either way, but I'll let the others talk.
Perhaps it has to do more with where they are located. So there can be a little bit more jump on the bandwagon overseas away from the centre, but you have to be more, toe the party line closer to the centre in North America. We know, I see from China at a time when in the States they're very anti-ecumenical, the missionaries are actually cooperating with other denominations in China. They're quite happy to sit down and pray and worship and talk to and receive advice from.
If I could just come in before Lindsay on that particular point, I think there is greater flexibility to the mission field, but equally, this particular aspect isn't an area where the church, there's no need in what you're describing to, it's not a resistance to the party line, or if such a thing exists. So I think it probably, I'm thinking aloud, and Lindsay may disagree, I think it probably depends partly on the issue. The flexibility is limited, but I do think too, your point about the missionaries themselves is, one would see that in many places. So I think that's a good point to underscore.
I saw a hand up. Lindsay, did you want to respond to this?
Just briefly, though from my case study, though from my case study, I see an appropriation and kind of instrumentalization of a project.
Right.
But there also was very critical at the same time. For example, in 1945, the Oriental Watchman launched a very serious critique and says, well, we think government could have done far more than it has done, especially for the people, and unless the future plans include the uplift of the people, and unless it is based on the willing cooperation of a happy, satisfied people, India will not be any better from a change of government. No real uplift has been left to foreigners like missionaries and others to tackle the uplift problems of India. I think there was kind of a tension there, appropriating, but at the same time moving forward and trying to bring it and to look at it from their own perspective of the gospel.
We're almost out of time. I don't know. Did you have your hand raised, Doug? I saw Dermot's hand. I didn't know if I also saw yours. Doug and then Dermot. Yeah. We literally only have about 5 minutes.
Just real quickly, the single positive reference to the social gospel that I found, Gary, in the review is by Frederick Lee, who I assume had been, after he served as a missionary to China. And he appropriated, he says, yes, we have an Adventist social gospel, but then he redefined it.
There's always a disclaimer. There's always an explanation.
Yeah, well, yes, true. But anyway, I just throw that in.
I was just directing this in follow-up on what Zach was saying. I do think that Adventists on a whole have a fear of the cities. I'm looking at the churches in this area. I wrote down Beltsville Church, Seabrook Church, Tacoma Park Church, Sligo Church. 15, 20 years ago, they were all white. I remember, I keep asking myself, where are our white members going? Where do they go to church? They don't go to church in the cities. The cities are almost completely left to the black members. And I don't know whether they have the idea that they're supposed to work the cities from the outpost or what, or I don't know what it is. But have you noticed the change in the composition?
Of course, yeah.
How do you explain that? Do our
It's just sociology.
It's sociology.
Yeah.
Yeah. What does that mean?
How long have you got?
I mean, I think white flight is a well-known phenomenon.
But where are they going? I predict that Spencerville and
right, suburban. That's what suburbia is for, isn't it?
In 10 more years, where will they go? I don't know.
And the irony, I think that here too we've got Ron's question, but I think the youth is and the social gospel is currently coming back as a way to retain our young people, and so is urban ministry in many ways as a way to retain our young people. Ron, do you have a question directed at?
Well, I think they could respond to this, but I think many of our speakers yesterday and today have spoken of the function of apocalypticism within Adventism. And some of us had said the great disappointment didn't happen in 1844, it's happened every year since then. And yet, Adventists have this capacity to keep saying, Christ is coming soon and we need to get busy. But then again, we're going to need this new building and it's going to last for 40 years, 50 years, And I think we need to look sort of at all of these phenomena and find how does apocalyptic delay function in the motivation of Adventists, period. You say, hope springs eternal in the human breast. Man never is, but always to be blessed. But hope is an important factor in motivating people. And all of us could look at that and say, how does it really work?
It's interesting, Lindsay, I saw you wanted to say something.
No, it's just like Arthur used to say, keep the healthy tension. You say tension that we just need to hold. Yes.
Well, join me in thanking our panelists.
We'll now go into our break. Because we're running late, one of my colleagues, a retired General Conference Vice President, is fond of saying there's no such thing as a 10-minute break or an academy loan. That's a joke that only certain people